So do something, do something so that I have a grade to give you. And of course, I'm not gonna look at it until, I'll probably grade over the weekend, but I have to turn in the grades by 5 o'clock on Monday. So if you haven't taken any of your tests or anything, and you should have taken, wait a minute, this is chapter 6, yeah.
So one test.
Yeah, so the one test is ready and up, and you should have all that
that's 1 to
information.
5.
1 through 5, yeah.
Like 75 questions.
Psychologists, along with psychiatrists and other physicians, often testify as expert witnesses in rape trials, especially about the nature and the consequences of rape trauma syndrome. Courts around the country are divided, however, on the admissibility of such testimony, and of course, this was very evident with the Kavanaugh hearing, hearings, because he was accused of getting drunk and sexually molesting Christine Blasey Ford, or attempting to molest her. Odd things have happened, but it's like the Republicans are going in one direction, and the Democrats are screaming, we need to stop this sexual assault stuff, and the Republicans are saying, poor men, they're always being accused of raping people. So it looks like there's the conservative movement is saying one thing, and the liberal movement is saying something completely different. That's the way it looks right now. The question is, will this carry over for the midterm elections? So we all need to vote in the midterm elections. I vote in Iowa. I don't really have very many people to vote for, but you guys vote here in Arizona. You get to decide who is going to be the next senator from this state. Senator Flake is retiring. John McCain just died, but they filled his seat, and that seat won't be. You won't be able to elect a replacement for John McCain until 2020. So, but you do have somebody to vote for now. So I would encourage you to vote, because if you don't, they're going to ignore you. Damn it, they will ignore you. Politicians, and especially the Republicans like it when people don't vote, because it's easier for them to win elections if the vote is low. Democrats tend to win if a lot of people vote, because poorer people tend to vote Democratic. So the point is that you guys need to vote, and you need to show the people, the politicians of Arizona, that you are a political entity that they can't ignore. Yes?
Is there like some website you can look at to see their strength and their weaknesses of the different candidates?
You know, that's a tough one, because if you watch it on television, you get a lot of attack ads. So that's a really good point. You could go. Everybody's got a website. So if you're talking about who's running for Senate, and I'm not sure who's running for Senate. Does anybody know?
See, we don't even know who's running for senator because they don't come out here, or there's like no posters, or there's no.
Why don't they come out here?
I think there is the post box have like a.
Oh, that's right. You guys got stuff in the mail. I got stuff in the mail.
And then when you exit the post office, you see all the stack of booklets.
Oh,
I think people just take out their post office and just leave it there.
I pick them up so that I can use them to
fire.
start my fire.
There you go.
I usually do that with telephone books.
Yeah.
Okay. I pick up extra telephone books to start my fire with. Well, doesn't everybody? Isn't that why they're there?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I thought so. Okay, yeah, it's...
Not for ordering people who order.
The reason they don't come here is because you guys don't vote.
Oh.
They don't have to worry about you.
Well,
Right,
we can
Chris?
vote, they come out.
Why would they worry about you if you don't vote?
There's no threat.
Yeah, you're not going to vote anyway, so why in the world would they come out here? Why would they care to make you guys happy? You don't vote, so you need to vote, and you need to tell your neighbor to vote. And you need to tell your mom and your dad to vote. And you need to tell your grandparents to vote. You need to tell everybody to vote. You need to get everybody signed up to vote. And if they say it's not important, you explain it to them. That these Belaganas are going to ignore you guys if you don't vote. They're going to pretend you don't exist. And if you don't vote, you don't exist, as far as that goes. Who's running for Senate, do you know? Have you seen any advertisements on television?
I don't want to see
Same, I don't watch TV.
Yeah, I only watch Netflix on my computer.
That's a different story.
Okay.
I can't afford Dish, only Netflix.
Two basic strategies have been emphasized. We're talking about preventing rape, training potential victims how best to protect themselves against rape. For example, women who do not resist a rape attack were twice as likely to suffer a completed rape as women who tried to protect themselves. Now, the reason that women don't try to protect themselves is because they're afraid that he's going to hurt them. He's going to force them into whatever he wants them to do, and he will injure them or kill them. So women don't fight back. And this has been a theory for an extended length of time. Older men will tell you, well, don't fight it, just, sit back and enjoy it. That's one of the things that they say. But the reality is, if you fight, he's less likely to be able to complete the rape. A second strategy is designing effective treatment for rapists so that they do not repeat their crimes. One way is chemical castration. We can give them drugs that will make them unable to have an erection. We can give them drugs that can make them have an erection. That's Viagra and Levitra and Cialis. But we can also give them drugs that will make it less likely that they will have an erection. And the stuff that we give them is the same stuff that was in Norplant. I'm trying to think what Depo-Provera is what it is. Depo-Provera allows women not to get pregnant, but it also makes it almost impossible for a man to have an erection. So that's the drug that we give them, is Depo-Provera.
A lower dosage or a higher dosage?
I think it's a lower dosage, if I'm not mistaken. I've never been involved with anything that has to do with chemical castration, so I'm not exactly sure. But it works. In the typical rape prevention program, participants discuss several facts and myths about rape. They learn how to avoid situations involving heavy use of alcohol, practicing resisting pressure for unwanted sexual activity, and role play other strategies for protecting themselves. They had one of these a couple weeks ago.
Rad training?
Yeah, exactly. And Sue went to it, and all she did was complain about it.
It was alright, I did it over the summer.
Did they teach you how to
Yeah, it
beat
was.
the crap out of this guy?
It was very intense.
Right.
It was very intense, it's like a really hard workout, but
Right.
they taught me a lot of techniques on how to get out of a situation,
Right.
and it's really interesting.
Good. All right.
Like, just using different moves, your body on how to
Right.
get away, because there is a way to get out of, when someone's forcing you down.
Especially if they come up from behind. Yeah.
So there's different ways, and it's interesting.
The other, one of the techniques that they show you is to use the open palm, so that you hit them with the heel of your hand, rather than try to punch them. If you punch them, you break your fingers. So you got to be really careful, especially if you don't quite hit them correctly. Catch them on the side of you bust this finger, bust it all the way down into your wrist.
And then at the end, the final kind of exam is they do the guy, the person that's doing the, what's it called, the session with us, he goes full out on us, he doesn't hold back.
Oh, really? How'd you do?
He'll go into our, a chokehold with us, and it really hurts,
Yeah.
but it kind of opens your eyes, and when you're out there now, you're really aware of making sure that you are in a safe area.
Right.
And I'm more aware of my surroundings, and especially for my kids.
A lot of people ignore this stuff, and of course, being in the military, they train you to be aware of everything that's going on around you. But as as females, you need to also be aware of everything that's around you. The world is a lot more dangerous for you than it is for me. Nobody's going to come up behind me and try to sexually molest me, I'm guessing, I don't know. No, not even my wife finds me attractive, so I'm guessing all those gay men that want to have sex with other men, they don't find me attractive either. I told you that I've only had one prostitute try to pick me up. It's only happened to me once in my life. Other guys, they walk down the street and every third woman they come to tries to seduce them. It's never happened to me. It's a tragedy. Sad to be so ugly.
It sounds like you're upset about it. Just kidding.
I'll be okay. In some states, men convicted of sex crimes are required to complete a sex offender treatment program before being considered for parole. And if they don't pass the sex offender treatment program, sometimes they'll take them all the way to the end of their sentencing. They will not allow them to be paroled until they pass this class. Now the problem, and this is good, I mean this is a really good idea. So if it's just a normal guy that made a stupid mistake, then potentially he'll be able to be paroled. That's a good idea. However, we have individuals who suffer from antisocial personality disorder. These individuals are professional liars. They'll go through this program pretending that it's taking hold, and of course it doesn't take hold at all. The two best liars in the world are alcoholics and people with antisocial personality disorder. They can lie themselves out of just about anything.
That sex offender treatment program, is that where the psychologist comes in and counsel these individuals?
Mm-hmm.
Most likely, is it a male counselor?
Yes. Yeah, because if it's a female counselor, they don't get a lot done. These individuals, because they haven't seen women for a while, unless of course they've got people visiting them. But a lot of times these guys aren't allowed to have visitors. Because sometimes the visitors will have sex with the inmates. What? Yeah, they'll go disappear sometime. I don't even think about it. Don't even think about it. Anyway, but these guys won't be allowed to have visitors. So they haven't seen women for an extended length of time.
To register for a sex offender, do you have to be an adult, like 18 years old?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I thought I saw some documentary, like the 16-year-old, I think. I don't know, maybe
It all depends on the state. There are some states where if they try you as an adult,
okay, yeah.
yeah,
But if they don't, is it just a slap on the hand?
pretty much. So that individual will not have they won't have to register as a sex offender, even though they've done something horrible. Potentially. The idea is that they're not mature enough to understand what they've done. The treatment of rapists can involve psychological, physical, and/or medical procedures. On the international scene, neurosurgery and surgical castration have been used, but their effectiveness is unclear. The reality is you can castrate somebody, you can remove their testicles, but they still can have an erection. So that doesn't always work. So they can still rape.
What about vasectomy? Oh wait, never mind, that's a different thing. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a different thing. But that's really interesting because they developed the technique for vasectomy for individuals that had this problem. Usually it had to do with masturbation, but it was an individual that had this problem. And theoretically it worked, but of course vasectomies do not have anything to do with whether you have an ability to have an erection or not. Yeah, it has nothing to do. One thing has nothing to do with the other. So these are the countries that have chemical castration. There are 8 states in the United States that have chemical castration. Germany has surgical castration. So if you rape in Germany and you are a serial rapist, they can this can be your punishment. is actual physical castration, surgical castration. Denmark, because the Germans did it, the Danes did it in 1929. They decided that they could castrate people. In 1973, they passed a law where they could use chemical castration. The reality is that physical castration doesn't stop them from having erections, of course, but chemical castration lowers their sex drive, and that works. Depo-Provera, like I said before, is usually what they're using. Norway, surgical castration, starting in 1977. The Czech Republic, surgical castration, 1966. Poland, chemical castration, 2010. Finland, surgical castration, 1970. Sweden, surgical castration starting in 1944. And then Korea has started using surgical or chemical castration. So those are places that you really don't want to get caught doing anything you shouldn't do. Or you may not be able to have sex for the rest of your life.
What about a woman rapist?
Well, we can't castrate females.
They are out there.
They are out there. They do exist. It's one of those new areas that we haven't really dealt with yet, so we haven't really changed any laws or anything. It is possible. It is possible. But it's relatively uncommon. In the United States, it is not uncommon for anti-androgen drugs to be prescribed to sex offenders in order to reduce their sex drive, a procedure sometimes referred to as chemical castration. As I said, the anti-androgen that is normally used is Depo-Provera, which is a female, which we use it as it's a female agonist. And anti-androgen treatments have problems, negative side effects. The rate of men dropping out of such treatment prematurely is very high. As long as they're giving them shots, Depo-Provera is usually a shot, it's not a pill, then they have to come in, every 4 months they have to come in and get their Depo-Provera shot. Just like women have to have a Depo-Provera shot every four months to keep them from getting pregnant. India has a really serious problem with rapes. I think I told you about the little girl, 12-year-old, that was she was herding her sheep, and she was seized by a group of men, and she was raped and murdered. She's only 12 years old. They wanted to let the men go because she was a Muslim and they were Hindus, and I know. There was another case where, it was a very similar case, where a woman that was 18 years old was raped on a bus by a group of men, raped and murdered on a bus. This case went to trial. It looked like they were going to let them go, and then finally in the end they convicted them and put them in prison for, I don't know, 10 years or something, for rape and murder of this lady on a bus. As odd as that seems. So they have a really a much more serious problem. They don't take rape nearly as seriously as we do in the United States. And of course now with the whole Brett Kavanaugh situation, this has come to the fore. Sexual assault has come to the fore, and there are women demonstrating today in front of the Supreme Court because they start hearing cases. I think they started on Monday, but they've been demonstrating against Brett Kavanaugh, the fact that he potentially or allegedly assaulted Christine Blasey Ford. And women around the United States are very upset, especially if they had been molested at some point. These individuals are really upset. They're upset with the people that voted for them. One of them is Susan Collins. Susan Collins looked like she was going to be the deciding vote, and she voted for Brett Kavanaugh's appointment, and now there is a movement in Maine to get rid of her. Not to impeach her, but to get rid of her in 2020. So we'll see what happens.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry. I know, this is for a bull. I'm sorry. That's the tool they use to castrate bulls. The treatment does not always reduce sexual arousal and sexual offenses, and that's the problem. So these individuals still can rape. One of the things that we notice, and when we start talking about serial killers, sometimes these individuals it'll be a sexual situation, but they will not complete intercourse. They won't have intercourse with the person that they kill. But they will put them in a sexual position, they will do select sexual things to them, but they won't have genital intercourse with that select individual, as interesting and crazy as that is. So they can still have sexual arousal. A lot of times men will put women in a situation where they would rape them, but they won't complete it because they don't have the capability. They have lost the capability to do that, but there is still sexual arousal. One of the reasons that they're murdering the individual is because they're angry at her because they can't become sexually aroused. And so they blame her for their lack of ability to have sex with her, so they go ahead and murder her. And they'll do all kinds of interesting things to her. Okay. And if you ever watch these television shows, if you watch FBI or Criminal Minds or any of these other television shows, you'll run into individuals that are serial rapists or serial murderers that they are would-be rapists. And this is the reason that they are murdering the individual, is because they feel frustrated because they can't have sex with them. In some men, arousal is not dependent on their level of testosterone, so the drugs have little effect on their sexual behavior. One of the things that we do know is that men that snort cocaine, they will lose in the beginning, of course, it acts somewhat as an aphrodisiac, but the more the cocaine that they snort, the less sexually aroused that they will become. So what will happen with these individuals is that they will, when they get into a sexual situation, they will do abusive things to the female because their sexual arousal is truncated by the cocaine that they're snorting. Whereas the cocaine had become an aphrodisiac in the beginning, now of course they've snorted so much cocaine that it's keeping them from being sexually aroused. And because of that, they're being physically abusive. They're being sadistic to the individual. They're torturing them and whatnot. So we see this also a lot with individuals who snort a lot of cocaine. Rape is often an act of violence, not of inappropriate sexual arousal. Consequently, drugs aimed at reducing sexual desire may be pointing at the wrong target. The reality is that these men are having problems. It has to do with violence. And it's the violence that they enjoy, not the sexual intercourse. And for that reason, you can go ahead and castrate him if you want, but this guy's still going to be doing the same thing he was doing before. So we may be aiming at the wrong target. It's not the fact that he can't, or the fact that he is sexually aroused. It's the fact that he wants to injure, and he wants to perform violent acts on the female. Another approach to treating aggressive sexual offenders involves combining several behavior therapy techniques into an integrated treatment package. And if you've ever watched, what is it, Orange? It has something to do with Orange. Wait a minute. All I can think of is Soylent Orange. What is that? What is the movie? Clockwork Orange. Thank you so much. Okay, Clockwork Orange. It's a really interesting and strange movie where it's a dystopia of the future. Of course, we're talking about a dystopia. But in the end, they catch this guy. He was the one that raped and murdered somebody's wife, and the guy's very, very important. So they take him and they treat him. They do all kinds of interesting techniques to him so that when he sees a naked woman where he normally would have been aroused, now all of a sudden he starts screaming and crying and holding on to her legs and begging her to forgive him, those kinds of things. Anyway, it's kind of an odd movie. It's a really odd movie. Mm-hmm. And in the end, they have to turn him back to the person he was before, which was a horrible, horrible person. Anyway. Watch Clockwork Orange. There's some nudity in Clockwork Orange. And there's rape scenes in Clockwork Orange. But it's really kind of an interesting movie. Anthony Burgess is the guy that wrote the book. Existing programs appear to be able to produce short-term decreases in recidivism, but long-term improvements have been difficult to achieve. As a result, relapse prevention techniques have been added to some programs to keep them from relapsing. Something I need to warn you about, yeah, she's got her earphones on, okay. There was a case a couple of weeks ago of traffickers on the reservation following a select woman. She turned them in. First the police didn't respond, but finally they did, and they stopped the individuals. They were two Belaganas from Florida. They had weapons in their car. They had chloroform in their car to knock the individual out, and they had ties to secure the individual. So this is just a warning. This is real, and this is here. And you might ask yourself, why don't they just go down to Phoenix? Wouldn't it be easier to find somebody? No. How many cops do you guys have on the res? You know, what's the probability they're going to get caught here? But down in Phoenix, there's all kinds of police. But yeah, this is an isolated area. It's easy to catch somebody. People will not miss the individual. So they're here, and they're all around. And we're not exactly sure who they are. I don't know if they're all Belaganas. They may be, but or they're all from Florida. There's a lot of people. I went down to dinner with Marius Begay last night, and we passed a guy that was from California, driving really slow, and I'm thinking, yeah, I just told Marius what had happened. And I said, it could have been him, you know, it's one of those deals. Well, it could be that guy, you know, that kind of a situation. Anyway, he's a guy from California. This is just something you need to be aware of. So if you've got somebody that's really more attentive than he needs to be, and it's usually younger guys. I guess they're men in their 20s and 30s are the ones that are doing the seizing. Usually there's more than one. One guy, it's kind of hard for him to secure an individual, but there were two guys in this car, and one guy was the one that was trying to induce the individual to come back to their car, and the other guy was just sitting there. So this is a hint and a warning. You can't trust anybody unless you know them. Okay, how's that?
I know back in August, I was driving back to Lakachagui, and there's this FedEx truck that was driving behind me, and it was like in broad daylight, and that FedEx truck drove beside me and slowed down, and there was two guys that was wearing a clown suit, like in broad daylight, and then they took off. When I looked at them, they took off in front of me.
Was it really a FedEx truck?
Mm-hmm. It was a FedEx truck. And I've been like getting calls from this guy from FedEx asking me if I'm home, and I'm like, I was like, I'm gonna call the cops, because like FedEx don't deliver on the reservation at home. They go to our post office.
Yeah.
Well, where I live.
Sure.
And it was just weird getting a call, and that guy got aggressive. He was like, I want to know where you're at. And I was like, I'm gonna call the cops on you, and he hung up on me.
Bruce, I'll tell how easy it is.
What, you're a FedEx guy?
No. we were in town, and my wife was walking up in front, and there was some people selling cologne. I don't know if you guys get encounter with these ones. They were telling her, come over here, look at this cologne. And I was looking at her, and I went like this. Just when she was ready to walk that way, he said, no, come on, let's go. And these, I think it was a squad or some squad, they all showed up there at once, and they took them down.
Oh, wow.
And there was like about 6 inside the car. And he had his trunk open like this. And
Oh my gosh.
They just took them down for dinner. So that's how easy it is. I guess they persuade people to come.
Sure.
What they're selling. So you'll never get this anywhere. Check this out. Look. She's all.
What was this?
It was in Gallup. You know where the Dollar Tree is? Around that parking lot.
Oh, okay. So this is, wow, that's the FedEx thing, okay. It's here.
So
It's
when
he-
you ask why some of us have to have weapons, now you know.
Well, okay. I understand that, okay. I don't need one.
Yeah. 'cause
Yeah, I
you're-
probably don't. I'm too old for anybody. Okay. I know. I already figured it out.
Just don't drive a van, Bruce.
I rarely look in people's cars. I guess maybe I should. I can see why you don't trust Belaganas, that's for damn sure. Yeah, this is a really serious situation. And I apologize that it's happening. I
Well, it's
wish
more of, we don't trust nobody.
Well, I don't blame you. I mean, all he was trying to seduce or induce her to come back to his car just by talking to him. So, somebody, and I struck up a conversation with a guy, I think it was a guy, so, in the post office, and he kind of ignored me, I guess. I don't know, I was talking about packages. Marius was there, he had a hoot. He was just laughing like crazy. Anyway, okay. So let's talk about men that seduce women. This is Dominique Strauss-Kahn. The guy on the right is Dominique Strauss-Kahn. He was nicknamed the Great Seducer because he had a way with women. And of course, as you can see, he's very attractive. He was also the chief of the International Monetary Fund. So he had control over billions of dollars, most of it from the United States. He's from Switzerland. While visiting a New York City hotel, he surprised the maid and forced her into oral and anal sex. This guy that's very, very wealthy. Although Strauss-Kahn was a renowned philanderer, it turned out that the maid had made accusations of assault before, though she recanted her testimony. The case was dropped because of the tainted history of both parties. He's a seducer, and she has accused men of attacking her before. And it turned out that it wasn't true. She recanted her own testimony. So here we have a lady that was attacked by this man, who is known as the Great Seducer, but they had to drop the case in New York City because neither one of them, both of them had histories of that type of behavior. So they had to drop it. One of the things that they were doing with Christine Blasey Ford, they were looking back in her history, trying to find incidences where she accused men of sexually molesting her. They tried to find incidences where she became drunk and was seduced, but they couldn't find anything like that. They went back in her history, the Republicans, in order to recant her testimony, or they were trying to get her to recant her testimony by threatening to ruin her reputation. And of course, she's a college professor in California at Palo Alto and Stanford. So it's kind of hard to say, well, this lady's just making this stuff up. Now, if she had done this before, then they could have said, well, she's just making this stuff up. It would have been easy for them to say that. But since they couldn't find anything in her history, it was very difficult for them to recant her, or get her to recant what she had to say. The prevalence rates, sexual harassment is fairly prevalent. For example, a study examining sexual harassment in academic medicine found that about half of female faculty experienced sexual harassment. This is the faculty we're talking about. We're not talking about the female students, we're talking about the female faculty. So these are older women who are being sexually harassed, potentially by the male faculty members. Both the women and the men experience sexual harassment. Both report that other men sexually harass them. So it's possible that a man will sexually harass another man, but it's very likely that a man will sexually harass a female. U.S. federal law defines harassment as follows: unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment when submission to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly as a term or condition of an individual's employment. In other words, you need to give in to me and then you can keep your job, that kind of a thing. Would you consider this sexual harassment? She's reaching over his shoulder.
No, but he's uncomfortable with it. He looks like
He does look uncomfortable with it.
it, yeah.
Well, that's not all that's happening, is it? She's not just reaching over his shoulder. She's also pressing her chest into his back. So that could be considered sexual harassment. And you can see that he's uncomfortable with it.
What if she's just really busty?
For real, or he's like a big man, you're trying to like, right here, the freaking.
Sounds like an
PowerPoint's right
excuse to
here.
me.
Denise is like,
The PowerPoint's right here.
instead of just going on to the side, off to the side and being like, yeah, that one.
Have you guys ever been to Hooters?
No, just kidding, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know those
The
things.
waitresses at Hooters will get down, they'll get down like this to take your order. Have you ever noticed that? They get down. And, well, they'll do that with the guys.
I'll take the wings.
Exactly, I'll take the wings. Sometimes people that work on computers will do the same thing. I don't know, they get down and you're thinking, have you been to Hooters? So, I know,
Let's
it's...
see if we're losing Kevin now.
Well, when somebody's working on my computer, I get up and let them sit down. Okay,
I usually do.
I do, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't. It must be uncomfortable for them as well. I mean, they need to be close enough so that they can see. If they're actually off to the side, most computers are blacked out, so they can't actually tell
See
what
from
they're,
the side, yeah.
they can't see. So they have to look from right behind you. I don't know what, anyway. Oh, that's not right. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as a basis for employment decisions affecting such individual. Such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. And this is something that everybody needs to be aware of. And of course, that man is touching that woman, and that's incorrect, certainly incorrect. Uh-oh, he's touching her shoulder. One problem with the federal definition of sexual harassment is that it leaves key terms such as unwelcome and unreasonably interfering open to varying interpretations. And of course, it all depends on the state you're in as to how they interpret it. The more traditional areas like the South, it's very difficult to get a sexual harassment suit through the courts. Other places, it's easier. California, for example, it's a little bit easier. When men and women differ in their evaluations of potentially harassing interactions, women are more likely than men to classify a specific act as harassment. She sees it as harassment and he does not. He doesn't understand why she's complaining about something as trivial as whatever, touching somebody's shoulder. Hostile sexism involves antipathy toward women, reflecting a belief that males are superior to women and should be dominant over them. My sister was a feminist, and she was a lawyer, and she worked in an office where the man was a sexist, which was really kind of interesting. However, she found him attractive. So despite the fact that this man was constantly degrading women, she let it slide because she found him attractive, which wasn't right at all. I know. And she would have been the first one to say, this isn't right, I shouldn't have done that. But that's what she did. And she never turned him in. But the next lady did. The next lady turned him in. I guess she didn't find him nearly as attractive as my sister did. Those high in hostile sexism are less inclined to conclude that sexual harassment has occurred. Of course, this man didn't consider it sexual harassment. This is back in the 70s and 80s. So the criteria for sexual harassment was much different than it is today. Benevolent sexism is an attitude of protection toward women. It reflects a belief that as the weaker sex, women need to be shielded from the world's harshness. It's very difficult I open the door for everybody. I don't care if you're a guy or a girl, I open the door for everybody. However, sometimes I feel a little strange when I open the door for a female because I'm afraid that she will see it as benevolent sexism. That's what I'm afraid of. So what do I do? What do I do? I open the door.
Let her open
I
the next
know.
one.
Let her open her own damn door.
Close
No, I open the door anyway, and I'll hold the door for people. Not because I'm stronger than, I see myself as stronger, but because I got there first. And it seems to me like, you know, and sometimes I'll get in a situation where you're at a restaurant, you open the door for somebody, and you get like a whole stream of people coming through. You feel like the doorman, and you're standing there, and it's been like 2 minutes, and everybody keeps coming out. And of course, you want to open the door for an older person that's trying to make their way through the door, right?
Yeah.
And then their grandson comes wandering through, so what do? You slam it in his face?
I
Exactly.
usually say, you got it? Door, I'm closing it. And then I just leave it
I'm
and
letting
walk
this
off.
damn thing go.
That's probably
Here.
why they don't know us. They don't say thank you.
They don't.
That's why I just let go.
Just let it go.
Yeah.
Slap him in
I'm
the
like,
face.
got it, door's closing, okay, you're a smart person, you got it. Kudos for you.
And I always thank people when they open the door. The courts following federal guidelines have recognized 2 types of sexual harassment. The first type is known as quid pro quo harassment. This is seen as implicit or explicit bargaining in which the harasser promises a reward or threatens punishment depending on the victim's response. Quid pro quo, and that means for this is what it means. I will give you this, you give me that. That's quid pro quo, means this for that. Hostile workplace harassment involves demeaning comments such as touching or attempted intimacy or the display of provocative photographs or artwork. I had a friend that got fired for looking at pornography, and unfortunately he was in a cubicle, and since he was in a cubicle and he was looking at pornography, the people that walked past his cubicle could see what he was looking at. They were more offended because he was looking at gay pornography, and they were women that were walking past, but they were offended despite the fact it was gay pornography. I found that kind of interesting. And he claimed that somebody was going into his cubicle and putting up gay pornography, and it wasn't him that was looking at gay pornography. I found that kind of interesting. That somebody would sneak into his cubicle and find a gay pornography site or something.
Maybe he thought he was in the UK.
It was funny. Or it wasn't funny. He got fired. He actually lost his job. Teresa Harris was the rentals manager of Forklift Systems in Nashville. And this is actually a picture of the place. This is the Forklift Systems in Nashville. She suffered a number of suggestive and demeaning comments from her boss. She needed her job, so she ignored him for 2 years until he made a public sexual accusation. So she let it slide for 2 years because she needed the job, which is kind of a problem. She took her case to the court but received mixed results. She took the case to the Supreme Court to try to prove sexual harassment, though the lower courts claimed there was no proof of psychological harm. And of course, that's what you're supposed to do in a sexual harassment suit. You have to show that some harm was done. Harris versus Forklift Systems Incorporated, 1993. Should plaintiffs be forced to prove that they were psychologically harmed in order to persuade a jury that sexual harassment has occurred? The unanimous decision of the Supreme Court held that it was not necessary for plaintiffs to prove that they had psychological injuries. Okay, remember I told you that each state has their own rules. This was in Tennessee. Tennessee is a southern state. So in that state, in order to prove sexual harassment, you have to show that there's psychological harm. However, when they took it to the Supreme Court, it was a unanimous decision that they don't have to show psychological harm has been done. And she won her case. But she lost her job. So maybe she lost her case. She lost a lot of money. Actually, they had to pay her back pay. But she still lost her case, and she still lost her job.
They keep the guy on.
Sorry? Oh, the boss? Yeah, he owned the
He
owned the company. So I'm guessing he didn't get fired from, well, he'd had to fire himself. Which has happened to Papa John, the pizza guy. You know, we used to see him on television all the time. We're not going to see him anymore. He's trying to take back the company. He used a racial epithet in one of his meetings, and because of that, the board of directors fired him, despite the fact that he doesn't really own the company. He owns stock in the company, and so they fired him. But now he's trying to get the company back, despite the fact that he used that racial epithet. You can imagine what that racial epithet is. You hear it all the time in rap music. So, okay, that was a racial epithet. And that was what he said. Well, I hear it all the time, and I listen to rap all the time, and I hear it all the time in rap music. That was his excuse. The Supreme Court decision listed several criteria by which to decide whether an action constitutes sexual harassment, including the frequency and severity of the behavior, whether the behavior was physically threatening or humiliating, and whether it would unreasonably interfere with an employee's work performance. So despite the fact that she wasn't psychologically impaired by the attacks, these were the criteria that they used. How often did it happen? Was it physically threatening or humiliating? And did it interfere with her performance? Justice O'Connor's opinion suggested that if conduct was not sufficiently severe and pervasive as to create an objectively hostile work environment as defined by a reasonable person, then it was not sexual harassment. That was the criteria that they used. Now the interesting thing was that Sandra Day O'Connor was the first female Supreme Court justice. So the question you have to ask yourself, this is in 1993, the question you have to ask yourself is, if it had been all men, would they have made the same decision? Probably not.
But they
So-
wouldn't know.
Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't understand what's the problem? She put up with it for 2 years, which is what the appeals court said. She put up with it for 2 years, so what's she complaining about now? Why is she complaining today? But then again, we had Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court, and she changed men's minds. Psychologists have attempted to predict when sexual harassment occurs. Examples: the norms in specific organizations function to encourage the expression of harassment. Men who reported higher levels of authoritarian characteristics are more likely to engage in sexual harassment, which is very logical.
I've seen that happen.
All of that makes sense. So, which branch of the service do you think has more complaints of sexual harassment?
The Navy.
You're right. It is the Navy. Right. It's the Navy. But they also have a open line that people can complain to. And of course, this was a problem. Has been a problem for an extended length of time. It was under at the end of the Bush administration that they just opened these lines of communication. You could make an anonymous complaint against somebody in the military. It was during the Obama administration that they actually did something about the number of rapes in the military. It's far higher than it is in any other branch of the service, or than any other area. So it is the Navy. So why would the Navy have more problems than the Army has? As far as sexual harassment is concerned, the number of rapes, the Navy doesn't have as many rapes as another branch of the service. The Air Force? No, they were actually the first ones to do any of this stuff, to try to do something about it. So the Air Force is at the bottom of the pile. So who's at the top? Which branch of the service has the worst problem with rapes? Turns out not to be the Army. It's the Marines. It's the Marines. And part of the problem is this right here. A little bit more authoritarian, different mindset. They have different mindsets. It was a Marine general that was accused of rape. Yeah, it was a Marine general that was accused of rape. We don't see that in other branches of the service. We see seduction. We see mistakes being made. What's the guy's name? Started with a P. He was the head of the CIA. And it was discovered that he was having sex with a reporter and giving her classified information. I can't think of his name. Anyway, he had a problem with it. Interesting. They found sexual harassment charges were more likely to be resolved in favor of the complainant when the harassing behaviors were serious. The complainant had witnesses to support the charges. The complainant had given notice to management prior to filling formal charges. A lot of things happened with the Kavanaugh-Ford situation. One of the things that happened was the Republicans were complaining that there were no witnesses, that people couldn't remember, so that there were no witnesses. How serious was the behavior? Well, she said that she felt like she was about to be killed. She was afraid he was going to kill her by mistake. She said it was by mistake. She didn't complain about it when it happened. She was only 15 years old, but she didn't tell anybody. And because of that, of course, it didn't get carried forward when she complained about it during the Kavanaugh hearings. Sometimes offenders are victims or claim to be victims. Some of these defendants have used a sex abuse excuse, the legal tactic by which criminal defendants claim a history of abuse as an excuse for violent retaliation. In other words, they've been abused in the past and now they're retaliating, and that's therefore they are a victim as well as the individual that was sexually molested. Such defenses seem to be met with increasing skepticism and with a willingness to blame the offender. And of course, if we're serving beer to minors, I guess maybe we should expect that minor to do something stupid. Okay, and that is the end of chapter, thank goodness. It's 11:22. 11:50, we stop at 11:50, okay. Okay, hey, I'm catching up. This is kind of exciting. I'm not so far behind. And now we're on chapter 7, okay, evaluating criminal suspects. One of the interesting things that happened last year, we hired a lady that was actually a criminal investigator, had worked as a criminal investigator for 7 years in Marion, Indiana. She was a social worker. I know, we were all so excited because this lady was actually a criminal investigator. So she could do the criminology classes. She knew all about this stuff. She lasted a semester. She's gone now. She was a criminal investigator. She's a little bitty thing. She had been a cop for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Yeah, she's kind of cool. I hired her.
She's gone. Just gone.
I know she's gone.
Just kidding.
I hired her. She's I'm from Muncie. She's from Marion. It's like 30 miles apart. We spoke the same language. We understood each other. because, you know, we spoke the same language.
Came from the same culture.
We came from the same culture, thank you very much. She was a Marian giant and I was a Muncie Bearcat or something. Behavior scientists and police are use criminal profiling to narrow criminal investigations to suspects who possess certain behavioral and personality features that were revealed by the way the crime was committed. So we can look at the crime scene and sometimes we can tell who did it and why they did it and how they did it, just by looking at the crime scene because of the things that they left behind. Profilers typically must have experience as a criminal investigator. Only 10% of the psychologists and psychiatrists surveyed reported any profiling experience. Let me tell you about my profiling experience. I think I've already told you this. Once upon a time we had a man that was killing 12-year-old blonde-headed blue-eyed boys. And this was in Bellevue, Nebraska. Eventually he killed 3. So after he killed the first one, they didn't do any profiling. But once he killed the second one, we realized we had a serial killer on our hands. I was teaching English at a high school that was very close to Bellevue, Nebraska, Springfield, Nebraska. It's about 15 miles away. So a lot of my kids, they did their shopping in Bellevue. And some of my students were blonde-headed, blue-eyed males. They weren't 12 years old, but they were blonde-headed and blue-eyed. And this guy seemed to be targeting blonde-headed, blue-eyed boys. One of them had been a paper carrier, so he was out riding his bicycle at 6 o'clock in the morning, got snatched off the street. They found his bicycle, all that stuff. And then eventually they found his mutilated body down by the river. So the second time it happened, the kid was waiting for the school bus, and he was waiting in a relatively isolated place, got snatched off the street. He was taken down to the river, down river from where the other kid was killed, and the same thing happened to him. Okay, so the individual that was doing the profiling was a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist, I knew the psychiatrist, he was on the board, the school board. And his name was, I'm not going to tell you what his name was. Anyway, he was on the school board, and we talked about this case. He knew that I was a psychologist, and he knew that I was teaching English. But we had a conversation about it, and I hadn't really done that much profiling before. When I'd worked in the Air Force, when I was in the Air Force, lab techs were the profilers. As it turned out, we were like the CSI people, because they didn't have any CSI people. So we turned out to be the CSI people. We did the blood typing and whatnot. We analyzed various substances and whatnot. So that was our job. So he, one day, I had a conversation with him, and it was, we were talking about who we thought it potentially was. Well, somebody had seen somebody leaving the scene of the crime. They didn't realize it was a scene of the crime at the time because they hadn't found the body yet, but they saw this guy leaving. They knew what kind of car he had. He had a late model Oldsmobile. They knew what kind of hat he wore, and they knew that he had a short haircut. Well, this is in 1983. And in 1983, people had long haircuts. People had long hair. The only people with short hair were military people. So since he had short hair, and since he was wearing a black stocking cap, or watch cap, was what they call it in the military, since he had a black stocking cap on, I said I thought he was a military guy. And he said, no, I don't think so, because if he was a military guy, they would have profiled him in the military. You know, they have psych evals all the time on these people, and they would have caught him. And I said, I don't think so. I mean, how many people with short hair are out there? Not very many. Only military people have short hair. And why in the world would he wear a black stocking cap? This is right beside Offutt Air Force Base. the Air Force wears black stocking caps. That's what they wear when it's cold. They wear black stocking caps. And he said, no, everybody has a black stocking cap. There you go. It must have been Francis. Everybody has a black stocking cap. So we argued for a while, and of course he got upset because I don't back down. Anyway, and I told him I thought he was wrong, and he said, well, how much education do you have? And I said, well, I got a master's degree in psychology. He said, well, I've got a doctor. I'm a psychiatrist. He was a psychiatrist. He had a medical degree and he had a psychology degree, that which trumped my master's degree in psychology, and also my experience working with people in the military. And I told him, you know, this is going to turn out it's going to be a military guy. And he said, no, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So he turns in a profile. And it was like the next day, and this thing was in the newspaper, you know, his profile of what this guy looked like and who he was. He was a guy that lived on a farm someplace in rural Nebraska, and he tortured small animals. I mean, he did the whole thing. He had this guy all mapped out. It was some guy, and he shaved his head because, you know, he's a farmer, and he's an isolated farmer. And farmers only get haircuts like twice a year. So he shaved his head. You know, he had this whole thing worked out. But they knew what the car looked like. And so they looked for it everywhere. They looked for it all over Nebraska, all over eastern Nebraska. This is in Bellevue, which is right next to Omaha. So they looked for it all over the place, and they couldn't find it. And they couldn't find it, and they couldn't find it. And Finally, they decided that they were going to look on the Air Force Base, which they hadn't done up to this point. And weeks have gone by, and a third kid has disappeared. And they found his body, of course. So they decided to go to the Air Force Base. Finally, the base commander allowed them to come onto the Air Force Base. And so they looked all over the place. They couldn't find it. They couldn't find it. Finally, they found it in storage. It was in storage. It was the car. And it fit the description perfectly. And as it turned out, it was a guy that was exactly the same height as the person that they saw. He had a short haircut, of course, because he's in the Air Force. He had a black watch cap, just like he was supposed to have. And it turned out that he was the murderer. He had murdered 3 boys. And the reason he had done it was because he had created an avatar for Dungeons and Dragons. And his avatar was this person that snuck around and captured young men and mutilated and murdered them. But that was his character in Dungeons and Dragons. It was an avatar. And he was executed, I don't know, about 15 years ago. But yeah, I know, I was right, he was wrong. And of course, Kent Smith, after that, resigned from the school board. Because he didn't, no, he resigned from the school board.
Not gonna say his name.
Oh, did I say his name?
Yeah.
I am sorry.
Google it, hurry.
Sorry. His name was Smith, okay?
I'm gonna say my teacher was smarter than you.
You bastard, what's wrong with you?
Screw your PhD.
It was an MD. He was an MD.
MD.
And eventually what happened was, it turned out that Kent Smith was a reserve officer in the Air Force. And that's another reason why he didn't want to blame anybody from the Air Force. Bastard. Anyway, so that has to do with criminal profiling. I mean, it was fairly obvious to me that if he was wearing a black stocking cap and he had a short haircut, obviously he was an Air Force person. The cops didn't, because Kent Smith, I'm sorry, because the doctor argued that he profiled him and it didn't fit his profile. He said that wasn't right, and it took him another couple of weeks before they found the guy, and he murdered a 3rd kid.
So Ken was biased, and
he was biased. Of course, he was biased. Yeah, in favor of the military. He didn't want it to be a military person.
He shouldn't be a psychiatrist then if he's biased.
Well, we all have our
sorry.
ideas.
Well, he has to
No,
put it
you were
to the
absolutely
side.
correct. I mean, he should have looked at that with an open mind. but he had all kinds of interesting, his son had just committed suicide.
His ego probably.
He's a psychiatrist and his son just committed suicide. Evidently he wasn't a very good psychiatrist. No. He didn't even recognize the fact that his son was that depressed. Anyway, and his son was one of my students. Well, he actually wasn't my student. He was a 8th grade student for the other class. So I didn't have him in class. I didn't get to see the kid.
So that Jubert guy was the second.
Jubert.
Jubert was
Jubert.
the second guy to get the electric chair in Nebraska.
There you go. John Jubert, and he wasn't from Nebraska, he's from Maine.
Maine.
And he had murdered somebody up in Maine.
Yeah, there's like a profile of him on here about like what he used to do when he was younger, when he was 13. Started when he was really young.
And Ken Smith, I'm sorry. Does it have his name in there? Does that have Ken
That's what I'm
Smith's
looking for.
name?
I don't see his name in
good.
here.
Sorry.
I see Bradway.
Yeah. I might want to put that up.
See
I was like, edit this. Put Bradway's name there. You
Yeah.
can edit that.
It's pretty ugly stuff.
Yeah.
And I was coaching a freshman basketball team, male basketball team, and I had to tell my kids, don't ever go out by yourselves. I mean, most of these kids were blonde-headed and blue-eyed. This is that Scandinavian section of Nebraska. They were all Lutherans, so I had to tell them, don't go out because that's what he's targeting you potentially. So don't ever go out by yourself. And none of my kids were killed. Wow, they all lived in Springfield. So. He was murdering people in Bellevue. Yeah. The major source of research and development on criminal profiling has been the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the BSU. So if you watch Criminal Minds, it's about the BSU. It has been working on criminal profiles since the 1970s. Before the 1970s, we didn't criminal profile. We just kind of guessed. But since then, these guys have come up with different profiles for different types of murderers or offenders, and now we at least have a picture of what they might potentially look like. That's what that's what the psychiatrist was trying to do. He was trying to profile this individual, and he missed it by a mile. He missed it by a lot. You would think that he had never been around criminals before, which is a possibility. He may have been the wrong person to ask. And I was a teacher, I was teaching English at the time. Why is anybody going to ask me what the profile of this guy should look like? But I was also playing Dungeons and Dragons. Not with him, of course. I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I knew how people could get really involved with their characters. Some of these individuals would work on their characters all week. And they'd give them different powers and different strengths and different personalities, and they would, they'd come to the Dungeons and Dragons meeting, and they would have all this. They'd been writing all this stuff. It's like a book about their character, their avatar, and all of a sudden, they actually became their character rather than themselves. Of course, these were all kids.
That was before computers.
It was before
Yeah.
computers, so you had to use
Before
your
the internet.
imagination.
Yeah.
It was an interesting game. They tried to blame Dungeons and Dragons, and they tried to do away with the game, saying that it was causing people to be insane. But of course, the reality is insanity is within the person, not within the game.
What brings out
That's
this?
a good one.
Much of the historical focus of BSU was on violent offenders, especially those who committed bizarre or repeated crimes. But sometimes they missed. Profilers have interviewed those who have committed a specific type of offense in order to learn how they select and approach their victims, how they react to their crimes, what demographic or family characteristics they share, and what personality features might predominate among them. One of the problems we have right now is we have a lot of mass murderers, and we're having a difficult time figuring out who the hell these people are and why they're doing what they're doing. But there seems to be one every week. There were school shootings at the end of last school year. There were school shooting after school shooting after school shooting. We had a huge number of school shootings. Most of the kids died, so we couldn't profile them. We couldn't figure out who they are. But the kid that shot up Parkland didn't commit suicide. So we have him. And now we can figure out what it was that made him go off and become a mass murderer. The guy that shot up Las Vegas shot himself before he was captured. If we could have captured him, potentially we could have found out why he did what he did. We need to know this information so that we can put it in a profile, so we know what they look like.
I believe Flagstaff had an incident with the shooter sending notes, leaving notes.
Oh, really?
They used the profiling, and I believe there was two people.
Oh, 2 people were doing the killing.
No, it was just they were ready to start a shoot, like a school shooting.
Well,
They'll leave notes.
We know that that place north of Santa Fe, where the kid died, the kid from Florida died, they had 11 children that they were training to be school shooters. Who does that, and why do they do that, is the question. So we need this information. We really need this information. The more information we have, the more likely we're going to be able to figure it out before it happens the next time. When we see somebody and they fit the profile, we will start following them, and we will check up on them to make sure that they're not going to do something that they shouldn't be doing, like killing people. Okay. Historically, most homicides were committed by killers who were well acquainted with their victim, had a personal but rational motive, killed once and were then arrested. Usually people make a lot of mistakes the first time they kill. They leave a lot of evidence behind, so we can figure out who they are. When they killed the little 10-year-old girl, raped and murdered her, one of the things, well, of course, they found the body in the apartment. So it was fairly obvious what was going on. Then they found the profile, they found the mother. This is the mother, isn't it? Or is that the mother? I can't remember. This is the mother? They fought each other, didn't they? At some point. That's the reason they're all busted up. The mother and the boyfriend fought each other. And this is his aunt. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, she's his aunt. Wasn't she?
Who's that? His cousin.
It was his cousin?
His cousin, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this person's related to this person. And this is the mother of the 10-year-old. And she's the one that offered her daughter online to be sexually molested. I think she wanted her killed.
Is there a saying that the neighbors would call social services on her ever since the kid was a toddler? And it wasn't until she got into grade school and all that happened to her.
Right. She was in
So
the
this-
4th grade, wasn't she?
Yeah, so the signs were there from preschool, kindergarten,
But nobody did anything
but
about
nobody
it.
did anything about it because they were saying in the reports that people, her educators in preschool and in daycare kept reporting it to social services, but they couldn't. The neighbors didn't know why social service didn't take the little girl.
So why didn't Child Protective Services do something?
They didn't find evidence.
There was.
Yeah, they can't
there
just
was.
take somebody out of the home. Not without proof. Not without a good reason.
But
I
there
mean,
were
if-
reports.
They investigated and they didn't find enough evidence to take the child out of the home. Now the child is dead. However, we don't want them to just go willy-nilly into people's houses and snatch kids out of the loving arms of their mothers or fathers or whatever the case may be. Once upon a time in a land not that far away, it's just over there, Texas, I was getting a divorce. And my wife was in Illinois, so she didn't defend her, she wasn't there to defend anything. So I was the only one that wanted the kids. But I was told by the judge that he would never, ever allow a man to have a female child, to take a female child. Wait a minute. There we go. It's my wife. I'll call her back. She can't tell time.
Well, it's a different time here than there.
Yeah, it's an hour later there. Well, I'll call her in 6 minutes. And hopefully she still loves me. But what happened was the judge said that he would never let a man, because men always molest their female daughters, their daughters. So he wouldn't let me have her. Well, that's what he said anyway. But it turned out that she wasn't a resident of the state of Texas. She was a resident of the state of Indiana. And Indiana didn't have the same stupid laws or the same stupid judges. So he couldn't do anything, despite the fact he tried to take my daughter away from me. Just because, all men molest all women or something, I don't know. I don't know what was on his mind. A lot of killers here, a lot of pictures of killers. These are all mass murderers. In the past 2 decades, increased attention has been paid to patterns of homicides involving killers who attack multiple victims, sometimes with irrational or bizarre motives, and who are much less likely to be apprehended than in former days because their victims are strangers. And of course, this is the guy that shot Giffords down in Tucson.
Okay.
Yeah, he killed, 4 or 5 people, and he shot her in the head.
On the neck, too.
I thought it was in the
The head, and I think it grazed her neck. as well.
grazed her neck. This is the guy that shot up the theater in Aurora, Colorado. This is the guy that shot up Virginia Tech. I don't remember the others. This is the guy that shot up Newtown, the school, a great school. Shot and killed 26 first grade students and their teachers and the principal. He shot the principal as well. As weird as that. And then he shot himself. So the problem is, a lot of this guy we have, didn't he commit suicide? I think he's dead. This guy committed suicide. I can't remember who these 2 people are.
Charlottesville,
Charlottesville?
Black Church,
Oh! Which one is the,
top middle.
this guy in
Charlottesville?
it wasn't Charlottesville, it was Columbia. South Carolina? The Black Church?
Yeah.
Yeah, he shot all the people. Okay. Yeah, we do have him. And he's been convicted. And I think they're going to execute him, if I'm not mistaken. This guy has been adjudged insane. Well, obviously, Uncle Fester is insane as well. Anyway, okay. And some of the others committed suicide. This is a guy that shot up Northern Illinois University. Went onto the stage, killed the professor, and started shooting out into the students in the audience. Multiple homicides defined by Fox and Levin in 1998 as the slaying of 4 or more victims simultaneously or sequentially by one or a few individuals. There are 2 types of multiple homicides that have been identified. One is mass murderers, and of course we've seen a lot of mass murders in the last 2 years. Is there a reason why, what does Donald Trump being elected president have to do with mass murders? Do we know? It just seems to be happening right now, and it wasn't happening before. And the other, of course, is serial murderers. These are individuals, well, we'll talk about what they are. The mass murderer kills 4 or more victims in one location during a few minutes to several hours. Mass murders, of course, remain relatively rare. Not today. They seem to be more common. We have the lady that, a lady who shot up, went into a Walgreens distribution store and killed 3 people, and then she killed herself. Very rare for a female to do something like that. But we just had one last week, a woman that shot a bunch of people, killed a bunch of people, and then she shot herself. Very rare. Women don't, for one thing, women don't usually use guns, and the other thing is that it was a Walgreens. She shot all the female members.
Oh my God.
She only shot women,
Wow.
which was kind of interesting. It is estimated that about 2 mass murders were committed every month in the United States in the 1990s, resulting in the deaths of 100 victims annually. Of course, we have the mass murderer in Las Vegas who shot, how many? Killed 58? Isn't that how many he killed? Wounded 700 or something like that. Although most mass murderers are not severely mentally ill, they do tend to harbor strong feelings of resentment and are often motivated by revenge against their victims. Who was his first victim? This is the kid that shot up Newtown, the elementary school. Who was his first victim?
His parents.
His mother, yeah. He didn't have a father. It was his mother. Who gave him the gun? No, it was his mother. Yeah, he was, had Asperger's syndrome. And she wanted him to be able to defend himself. Yeah.
But he ended up killing.
Going into an elementary school and shooting 6-year-olds. 6-year-olds are cute. Why would you shoot somebody so cute? Right?
Maybe that's the age when he remembers when difficulty started. And so
Oh, because he had Asperger's syndrome?
Yeah.
He's stuck at age 6 years old or kindergarten.
How logical is that? I mean, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That's the first time he went to school, and when he went to school, people
Difficulties.
treated him badly.
Because they tend to keep that memory from
Sure.
back then, and they still have that rage.
Exactly. They couldn't defend themselves. So now they've become Superman.
There used to be a couple that lived at the apartment complex, and they had a bunch of kids. And I think 3 out of the 6 had Asperger's syndrome, and 1 had severe Asperger's syndrome. And it was crazy because it's like the dad might have had it as well, because he always walked around with a bunch of samurai swords, machetes, and he'd be outside swinging around.
That's scary.
Yeah. And nobody ever said anything or done anything about it, and everyone just kind of kept their distance from them and whatnot. And me, I'm a weirdo, so I was like, what's going on? You guys okay? What's up? You guys want to talk? Sure, come
Here.
on in, stuff.
Let me see that. Let me see
Let
that
me
sword.
See that. Just, yeah, let me see that sword. I was like, hey, this is pretty nice. I could wait.
It's time to stop. So I need to stop. I'll see you guys.